Hi, this is Ellen Wagner. I am the Chief Research Officer for the Predictive Analytics Reporting Framework, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session today where we are going to be talking about predictive analytics and intervention measurement in action. I am very, very pleased today that we're going to be joined by two rock star presenters, Beth Mulherrin from the University of Maryland University College will be here with us today talking about some of the work that she and her colleagues have been doing around the idea of first-year experience, and we'll be talking about her Jumpstart project. And she'll be joined by Scott James, the data scientist at the PAR framework that has been working with Beth and her colleagues as we have all been exploring opportunities for figuring out better ways for us to support students with the interventions that we currently have in hand at our institutions. Let's take a look. I would like to just make a couple of quick points about analytics in higher education before we turn it over to Scott and to Beth, because it does seem as if analytics in higher education these days are generating a lot of conversation, a lot of question, and in some cases a fair amount of confusion. So for us, when we start looking at this domain of analytics in post-secondary education, we find ourselves looking at learning analytics, which are typically the best ways for teaching and learning. We look at learner analytics, which are typically the best ways for supporting students who are engaged in their learning. And we also find ourselves looking at organizational analytics, which brings us to the best ways of operating colleges. For us at PAR, the focus has really been in this middle area, the idea that there are things that we can be doing to mitigate risks and to create more effective pathways for students to be successful by taking a look at the ways that we can support students more effectively by looking at their attributes, looking at the things that they want to do, and then looking at how we as institutional partners are able to respond to the needs of those students. So that, in a nutshell, is where we have been spending time with PAR. I wanted to share just one other quick graphic to help illustrate a point that has also been driving much of our work. People in higher education frequently talk about analytics and say to one another, well, we've been doing this forever. We in the academy are very focused on numbers and our research results. And while that's true, there's another side of this question, which is reporting on our own efforts. Typically in higher education, we've done a lot of reporting. We look backwards, we talk about what we did, we talk about opportunities for future work, and we go from there. As predictive analytics, as unstructured analytics, as the opportunity for leveraging data, it becomes much easier for all of us to work with, we find ourselves seeing that there's more we can do with our numbers. We can actually diagnose what's wrong. We can take a look at trying to figure out what we can do in anticipation of something happening. Can we predict pathways for more success? Ultimately, for us, being able to prescribe treatments so that we can actually realize the benefits of the predictions is, in our world these days, it's a bit of the holy grail. I will tell you that this is actually why we've been spending so much of our time at PAR trying to focus on what we can do to mitigate risk and to make it easier for students to be successful. So generally speaking, just a couple of quick points about PAR. Our focus has been to predict risk, to find pathways for success, and then to try to tie that information into a more effective use of interventions in which campuses are already making investments so that we can, in fact, target the interventions at the points where they'll get the biggest return. Ultimately, if we can identify those types of opportunities and we can share that information with colleagues, we will be doing what everyone asks us to do in education, which is to start scaling what works. And in doing so, we find ourselves creating a community of practice where, regardless of where one lives in the higher education ecosystem, the fact is that all of us are here because we care a lot about students. With that, I have one other point, and I do want to hand it over to Scott James. One of the things that PAR found is that by focusing on common definitions and ways of talking about our data in common ways, the shared vocabulary has done as much to help us further our goal of realizing more effective student success than perhaps even some of the work we've been doing on the data. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Scott. We've got Scott, we're talking about a couple things today. One will be the diagnostics in PAR, and then another side of this, of course, will be the web tools, looking at the student success matrix. So I think this would be a good opportunity for me to stop sharing, turn it over to you, and have you take it away.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay, so I want to start by going over the PAR Predictives dashboard. And in this dashboard, you're going to see some of the different metrics that we've developed here at PAR, and including the predictions we do with our predictive modeling, focusing on retention to the next year for any given student. So there are a few different metrics that you'll see here on the summary tab of the report, one of which is a student's GPA. The next one we're going to look at is credit ratio. And credit ratio is looking at the number of credits a student has completed with a grade of C or better, divided by the total number of credits a student has attempted. And for the sample data set we are looking at, the average student has completed about 85% of attempted credits. The next dial is retention risk. And this is looking at the probability a student will not be retained. So the probability a student will stop out within the next year. And this is coming from our predictive models. And here the average student has about a 27% chance of stopping out within the next 12 months. The next metric here is what we call a velocity score. And the idea behind the velocity score is to track how well a student is progressing to completing a degree. So the baseline here is looking at 15 to finish. A student who is completing on average 15 credits every term is going to have a velocity score of 1.0. A student who is completing anything less than that will be below 1, and students who are completing more than that will be above 1. We are additionally looking at other measures of velocity, and these would compare students to students who in the past have pursued similar degrees, and will compare students to the rate at which those students completed their courses. On the far left, we have another dial called PAR score. And PAR score looks to aggregate a student's retention risk from the predictive models and their velocity score. So it's combining the risk of not being retained with how well on track a student is to graduate on time. So once again, this measure is also normalized with the mean around 1. So typically the average student is going to have a PAR score around 1.0. For this particular set of students, they're a little bit below that threshold at 0.87. At the bottom of the report, you can see the number of students in the sample set, which we have 400, the average number of months enrolled, attempted credits, earned credits, prior credits, and withdrawn credits. And then we also have some ways to sort your results by different categories. For instance, here we can look at the percentage of courses students took online. So if we wanted to limit the metrics to students who took, let's say, 50% or less of their courses online, we can do that, and we can look at how some of the metrics may change. We can make similar queries for student age, gender, race, health status, student type, student's home location, and a student's program based on 2-digit CIP. So we can isolate students in any of these groups in terms of what we see in the metrics. And those drop-down options will stay the same for each of the tabs. So this next tab is going to look at what we call SSMX predictors. And these are predictors that can be tied directly to interventions that your institution is running. So not all of the predictors in this list are going to be included in the predictive model, though some of them certainly will be. This is looking at different possible risk factors and how students that fall into these different categories compare based on the metrics we showed in that first summary tab. So for instance, if you want to look at students who are considered non-traditional by age, who are 25 or older, you can see that affects about 129 students in our demo. The average PAR score is 0.83. The average retention risk is 36. So these students on average have about a 36% chance of not coming back. And their velocity score is 0.97, indicating that most of these students are right on track in terms of degree completion. So you also have the opportunity to sort any of these fields. You can sort, for instance, by lower velocity scores. We can see that our students who have low ongoing GPAs are not only behind in terms of credit completion, but they're also at pretty high risk of not stopping out, which you can see here. And their PAR score is pretty low, it's in the red. So this is looking at a lot of the results in aggregate. What we can also do with the same report is take it down to the student level. So here what you'll see in the far right is a PAR student ID, and these IDs would map directly to student keys at your institution. And they'll have the metrics for each student. So for instance, we could look at the student here who has earned 14 credits. Their retention risk is 0.24, so a fairly low chance that they will stop out, though there is some risk there. But their velocity score is fairly low, meaning they are behind in terms of completing 15 credits per semester. And this gives them a total PAR score of 0.71, which is a moderate risk score. Now, once we've selected the student, we can also see specific predictors that tie to interventions, what we call the SSMX, which I'll elaborate on shortly. And we can look at which factors affect this particular student. So the ones here that have higher PAR scores at the top are good indicators for the student. For example, the student has a very high credit ratio, which is indicative of success. On the bottom, however, we can see some of the predictors that may be placing the student at risk. In this case, the student is fully online, and that happens to be a risk factor in this demo set. The student is above 25, and the student has low velocity, meaning the student is not completing courses at a very fast rate. And you can look at these for any student you click on and compare the different risk factors that might be impacting a student. So we want to take this next from prediction to action. And the next stage is looking at targeting students through these risk factors. So once we've identified that, for instance, for this new student we've clicked on, both being low velocity and having a low credit ratio puts the student at risk. So we want to look at developing and tracking interventions designed to help with that. And that's going to move into the next stage, which is looking at the student success matrix. And this is an intervention tracking device, and this is open source and available on the PAR framework website. And it gives you a tool to track interventions and information about interventions going on at your campus. So we split vertically by predictor categories. We look at learner characteristics, so student age, how did the student perform in high school, was the student Pell eligible, to learner behaviors, which are things like credit completion, velocity, how is the student doing, learner fit, how engaged are they on campus, are they participating in clubs and student groups, category for other, and also interventions that can be tailored toward a specific course or program, and instructor behaviors. Going horizontally, we also look at things at different points in a student life cycle. So you can categorize your interventions based on time. So connection would be right around admission, before a student actually starts. Entry interventions are going to be early in a student's career, and this is where a lot of interventions tend to take place, so the first 6 months or first couple terms for a student. Progress is kind of the middle chunk of a student's career, and completion is maybe that last year or last term when a student is close to finishing their degree. So going back to what we looked at the watch list, we want to look at different interventions based on low credit ratio and low velocity. So you can drop down, you can look at the common predictors that are associated in this category. And you can list interventions or look up interventions that you have aimed at specific risk factors. So in this case, we're going to look at a student success course, which is targeting, one of the things it's targeting is students with low credit ratio. And this is entry level, so students who are early in their career. And you can edit or create the intervention using this form. So the first tab is a description. And here it's describing that this particular intervention is a student success course, and it's targeting incoming freshmen and also students who have made grades less than a C in any of their freshman courses. So this is where our low credit ratio students come in. The next tab is categorization, and this is where you can track interventions back to those risk factors we looked at in the previous tab. So of the potential risk factors for a student, you can check the ones that you want this particular intervention to target. Here you can see we're looking at students coming in with low GPAs, students who are new freshmen, students who are maybe transfer students. And in terms of learner behaviors, once again, we're targeting these students who have low credit ratios and low velocity within their first term. And you can also scroll through the various predictors and risks for all of the categories that we have here. And then as you scroll down, you'll also find information on how an intervention is delivered. Here it's at the student level. We're targeting new students, low high school GPAs, or entering with a GED. And the next tab is about implementation and measurement. So we've identified different risk factors that are impacting students at the institution. And we've developed an intervention that is aimed at targeting these students and improving outcomes. So the next question is, how do we want to implement? You can see that we've targeted this intervention for fall 2014. So the fictional intervention would have started last fall. The current stage or the phase of the student success course intervention is early implementation, meaning we're past the planning stage, but it is not yet ongoing. We're going to deliver this intervention online, and it will be delivered by student success instructors, how many students might be affected. And then the next piece is really the transition from looking at predictors and what we find to be predictive of risk to measuring the impact of interventions. So with this tool in place, it becomes efficient to track interventions and look at various interventions that target certain students. So we might have, let's say for example, in this demo, we have 5 or 6 interventions targeted towards students with low credit ratio. So the next stage is measuring these interventions and seeing which are the most effective at improving student success. So here we're listing the outcomes that we wish to measure. Here it's going to be GPA, credit ratio, and student retention. We're going to look at what kind of comparisons we want to make. So we're going to compare similar students who enrolled before this success course was offered to students who opt into the success course. We're going to define a target audience and define the baseline of measurement. And the measurement process is something that PAR has been working with, and we have an example looking, in fact, in measuring the impact of student success courses in a partnership with UMUC. And I'm going to turn things over to Beth Mulherrin and let her talk a little more about that particular example and the process of defining the interventions and also measuring the outcomes.
Thank you, Scott. This is Beth Mulherrin, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how we have used the PAR framework as a way of framing interventions at UMUC, and also the value, the power and value, the structure of a research-based framework with predictors provides for informing initiatives and then the data to measure those. Can I just verify that you can see my screen?
I'm currently not seeing it.
Okay, sorry. I was hoping you would.
There you go.
How about now?
There you go.
Okay,
There you
thanks.
go.
So the retention drivers that we focused on that Scott mentioned that are in the student success matrix, learner characteristics and behaviors, fit with an academic institution, and academic progress. As we looked at these drivers in an academic cycle, we were trying to rethink our approach to an orientation course at UMUC and look at those early experiences as students connect to our institution and as they enter into their first courses, primarily focused on readiness and motivation. In previous orientation courses, we focused more on helping the student understand our institution, how they needed to navigate, and looking at these predictors in a different way challenged us to think about how are we helping students understand their own readiness and motivation, because those are very important predictors for student retention. And we rethought our approach to orienting students to focus on the student, giving them some tools around their readiness and information about their strengths so that they were better able to mitigate any risks identified through this process. So we created a program called Jumpstart, which is a 4-week onboarding course called Creating a Learning Plan. And it's designed to help newly enrolled students create a personalized learning plan for their first year. So it's focused on those connection and ED3 touch points, readiness and motivation, goal setting, and commitment. And we really tried to distill lessons learned from a previous orientation course to pick out the elements that we thought would help the students the most. So the intent of the course was to prepare them for their first academic year and to give them some tools and resources to do that. So we took a problem-solving approach to the course design. We involved advisors, we involved faculty, and we really tried to, again, focus on the student and what could the student take away from the experience that would be most helpful to them. So we give them some diagnostics and tools for self-assessment, clarify career, academic goals, and then give them some supported experiences around creating goals. How do you do short-term goals to support long-term goals? If you have these challenges, what are your strategies to overcome what might be a challenge to you meeting those goals? And really just kind of a reality check around their the journey that they're about to begin with us. And the power of doing this, I think, in a problem-solving approach is it's up to the student to surface the strategies and have a check-in while they're in this early giddy phase of being a student. They're excited, and we all know that there can be some real challenges in the first few semesters, particularly for online students. And since our students are primarily online, we really thought it was important to help them understand, do you have a place to study, and what are some of the challenges you might have as an online student?
Beth, this is Ellen, and I just want to comment on how important that type of engagement with students really is, and how wonderful it is that you all are getting deeper into the weeds on what it takes to create a rich and meaningful jumpstart for students.
So the 2 deliverables in the course are this learning plan where we ask them to reflect on strengths and areas of concern and have them articulate strategies that they're going to use to address them. And then they also are required to submit a 3-semester academic plan. So rather than just, you know, create a plan without any context, the idea is if they work on this clarification of goals, have some input into their possible risks, that will inform their academic planning that they can then connect to a conversation with their academic advisor. So we were seeing some promising results from this in terms of re-enrollment, one-year retention, but we also wanted to look outside and use the PAR framework data set and information about other intervention programs that were similar to draw some comparison between, you know, program elements and outcomes and compare ours to others to further validate the results. And that's what PAR helped us to do by looking at other student success courses, conducting surveys, reviewing the syllabi, and doing the statistical analysis around the specific courses that were participating in the study. And of interest to us was that there were some very common elements in these courses that contributed very significantly to a positive one-year retention rate. And academic planning and degree planning was one of those common elements, and that was gratifying to us because that was something we really tried to focus on. And in other schools, they're also seeing a positive impact of that much more intentional academic planning and information about the program of study that a student has chosen, this idea of connecting with advising and not necessarily having it be a separate process, but really having the student be part of the conversation and not just filling degree requirements and working through a checklist, but really engaging with this idea about what is my academic plan and why am I pursuing it the way I am. And information about study skills and time management, which I think have been a component of student success courses, but maybe not in the context of academic planning in the way I think many institutions are evolving. Student success courses have been going through multiple iterations, and I think there's a level of maturity now that many institutions are focusing much more intentionally on this academic planning with the context of busy work, you know, lives in terms of time management and study skills, and again, particularly for online. And also the power of empowering students to understand the strengths that they do have and also identifying possible barriers to success. Again, students may start with very ambitious goals. They may just want the degree, but not really know how they're going to get there. And having an understanding of their strengths as well as areas they need to work on can be very powerful.
It seems like such a holistic perspective, and I guess that's the part that just impresses me, that by being able to bring the whole thing together, the likelihood of finding the, you know, meaningful paths is just so much more self-evident and obvious, isn't it?
Now, and I can't overstate the value of a framework, right? I've had so many conversations with academic advisors, with program chairs, this concept of, you know, progress, not just for the sake of marching through a plan, but intentionally looking at how are students connecting to us, what are the experiences we're doing at entry, and how are we seeing their momentum and possible bottlenecks in that momentum that we as an institution can impact, whether it's through policy changes, you know, examining just how we're communicating. I agree, Ellen, it's a much more holistic approach, and the power of having data underneath it in terms of the predictors and then being able to evaluate it is a game changer. I think it really is significant. So the PAR research highlighted the areas I mentioned in terms of the common elements of the student success courses that appeared to have a positive impact on one-year retention. But there are a few things to, you know, there's always more research one can do. And there's things you can't necessarily control for when you're looking at these kinds of interventions or when you're looking at student success. You don't know what other interventions are happening at the same time. And an issue that we've grappled with that, and many of these student success courses in the study were optional courses. So they may attract the more motivated students. How do you control for motivation? How do you isolate the student segments that might most benefit from this type of developmental activity, especially as they are onboarding at your institution? So a little deeper look at what are those elements of academic planning that seem to make a difference. And this idea that connecting with the institution, it can be asynchronously, it doesn't have to be a face-to-face, you know, drop-in center scenario. It does seem to have positive impact that they're having some connection with faculty or staff in a learning environment. And I would just add online, I think the students being able to use the LMS and have maybe a lower stakes entry into the online classroom. They learn how to upload an assignment, they learn about discussions. I think that for us, that is also a significant factor, that students are able to practice being a student in a pass-fail, you know. Course.
No, that's great.
So I will stop sharing. If Ellen, you wanted to take back the reins?
Well, I will, and I'm going to put up an image just for the remaining few seconds that we have here in the session. I want to thank both of you, Beth and Scott, for helping us get a sense of just how easily, here I'm just going to move forward just a little bit, pardon my scroll. We'll put up a nice picture of an academy since we're here. I just want to thank you both very much for both the description of how the predictives and the frameworks for intervention measurement can work together, and then Beth really helping us see how these things come together in practice. I think for so many of us, it's great to have the big ideas, it's great to have the tools, it's great to have the need to work with students, and I've just been so impressed with how you two have been putting these things together. So with that, I would like to thank you both, and we will look forward to hearing more about your great successes in the future. Thanks very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen.